All right, we are going to be talking about the von Thunen model. So this is one of the most important models that we talk about in this class, and really something that is at the heart of the agricultural unit, which is talking about basically the use of land in terms of agriculture and how we can predict how agricultural land is used in relationship between the market or a market and sort of the outlying area. So there are a lot of important things to keep in mind as you're thinking about von Thunen's model. The first of which is that it is from 1820s Germany. So Heinrich von Thunen, I think it's Heinrich, I don't remember, something like Heinrich von Thunen, um, lived during this time. So some general assumptions of the von Thunen model are basically that it is an isotropic plane. So what that means is basically a vast expanse of flat land that goes out in every single direction, um, with basically a market in the middle, which is a city. So the city is located centrally within an isolated state, which is self-sufficient and has no external influences. So each market is in and of itself its own thing. The isolated state is surrounded by an unoccupied wilderness. The land of the state is completely flat and has no rivers or mountains to interrupt the terrain. The soil quality and climate are consistent throughout the state. Farmers in the isolated state transport their own goods to market via ox cart across land directly to the central city. Therefore, there are no roads. And basically, the last one is that everyone acts um, in the most economical way possible in terms of maximizing profits. So the way von Thunen's model looks in theory is what you see on the left-hand side. Or actually, let's skip the screen and go back to it. What you see here, which is basically a series of concentric rings. So in the middle, we have our market. And surrounding the market, we have goods that either are perishable or would need to be located closer to the market. So that includes things like dairy. So that explains the presence of milk sheds, which are basically the series of dairy farms that we see in and around cities, but also things like commercial gardening and flowers and things like that that used to have to be close to the city. Kind of one ring out from that, um, in what's called the medium rent, we have what we classify as sort of the mixed crop farming, so things like corn and soybeans. Um, Within this at the time, this is missing one of the extra rings. We also had the timber ring kind of in between these two, because at this time, um, firewood had to be close to the city. But that's not super important in kind of the modern day application of von Thunen. And the last one would be the presence of more extensive crops. So that would also include things like livestock ranching, which have the most extensive use of land needed. So they are located further away from the city. And also things like cows could be brought to the city for slaughter or for processing. So that is kind of providing their own transportation. So this is kind of an overview of what von Thunen's model looks like. And to the right is maybe how it might actually look if a city has a river within. So you see kind of the market in the middle, the dairy farms closest to the market, and around the city, kind of the ring of lumber and firewood that we were talking about. And then kind of radiating from the city, um, other types of crops, and kind of furthest from the city, we have perhaps livestock farming or things like that that are will require the most extensive use of land. So we talked a lot about this, but one activity that we did in class that I really like and I think is actually good because it helps you thinking about how von Thunen might actually be useful these days is by looking at the state of Washington and looking at where we see some applications of von Thunen today. So just a second to kind of look at the map. So maybe pause it to look at the map and think of about 3 ways that von Thunen might apply. So some things I can think of are around Seattle. So we're assuming in this model that Seattle would be the market, um, and that, but you can also see kind of Von Thunen in relationship to some other markets like Portland down here, and even kind of little miniature markets of Eastern Washington. So some ways in which Von Thunen might apply is you can see the presence of the milk shed around Seattle, kind of the series of dairy farms that exist in King County or in Snohomish County. Also nursery and greenhouse, so that's mostly vegetable farms or flowers, things like that. So those are two ways in which we can kind of see Von Thunen a little bit. Radiating from the city, you can also see, the state of Washington, some of the things that we would associate with the state of Washington's farming, like apples and cherries and grapes and berries. Those seem to fit relatively well within Von Thunen. It's kind of stretching it a little bit. And then kind of one thing that does fit Von Thunen really well is in eastern and central Washington, you see lots and lots of extensive farming. Basically land extensive. So lots of production of things like wheat and hay, and then also a lot of cattle farming and a lot of use of land that is used for ranching. So basically, we see some applications of Von Thunen that sort of make sense. And down near Portland, you can see kind of Portland's milk shed a little bit. There are some other ways in which you can kind of squeeze Von Thunen into this if you're thinking about it, but I think those are kind of the main ones. And some ways in which Von Thunen doesn't fit. So obviously Washington is not a flat isotropic plane. So you can see all sorts of breakups of ways in which the geography of Washington sort of breaks up the concentric nature of Von Thunen. This part of the state doesn't really fit in super, super well to what we're talking about. And we also have the presence of multiple markets, like we talked about. So Seattle's a market, but also Portland is a market as well. And then you have things like Spokane, the Tri-Cities, other places that might be their own little markets too. So ways in which that doesn't really fit. And another way that we talked about when we did this activity is that much of the production of Washington State in terms of agriculture, things like apples or rainy year cherries or hops for beer, things like that are not used for to be consumed within the market themselves, right? There are huge crops that are shipped all over the United States and are not solely consumed within Seattle. So that is some ways in which Von Thunen doesn't necessarily apply. But I think it's pretty likely, if you're asked about Von Thunen, that you would be asked to apply it in a modern day sense. So thinking a little bit about this is a good idea. And also maybe think about some of the other models we talked about in class and try to apply it to sort of modern day senses of things. The last thing we'll talk about is looking at the entire United States. So, there are some ways in which you can maybe apply Von Thunen into the whole United States, but I think it gets pretty tricky there. So just a few things to point out. For one thing, you can see most of the quote unquote markets on the eastern half of the United States. So you can kind of see a little bit of kind of extensive field crops here, pastures and ranges and livestock ranching further to the west. So basically, I think the main thing to get from this is thinking about the value of land and basically what land can be used for. And the western half of the United States is far more likely to be used for livestock ranching because of its basically the topography and the character of the land. And the Midwest is more likely to be used for field crops and for things like soybeans here in this part of the country, or wheat here, cotton down here, and you can think of other things like kind of interesting different parts of the United States that have their own kind of character when it comes to agriculture. So this is all part of the idea of thinking about kind of the rural land use within the United States. So thinking about Von Thunen helps us do that.